Hi folks, this is David Birchall and this is the first of two lecture pods for week 7 of When Worlds Collide in spring 2020. This week we're looking at religion and liberalism is the broader question, but more specifically a fascinating famous figure in Indian history, Raja Rammohun Roy, who you see there on the right hand side of the screen. Top right you can see him in Bristol in England, bottom right you can see his grave in India. I guess suggesting that he was a man of both countries. This is the first of two lecture pods. Here I'm going to give background to Roy's life as well as introducing some aspects of him. And in the second pod, which you should hopefully listen to after this one, I'll say more about him personally. First of all, some thoughts on Rammohun Roy as a mediator. By a mediator, I mean someone who stands between cultures and, if you like, kind of negotiates between them, albeit that mediators often stand on one side of the divide more than they stand on the other. If we go back to the 15th and 16th centuries, when Europeans first encountered other peoples in a significant way after the discovery by Christopher Columbus of the New World, meaning his landfall in the Caribbean, the Spanish and the Portuguese voyaged into the New World, bringing mediators with them and taking mediators back with them. It was very important for them to be able to speak to locals, to attempt to make sense of the locals' languages, and from time to take them back to Europe, either to show off or to have them as mediators between the Europeans and the locals. It was a way of attempting to understand the colonised peoples better. This is something Christopher Columbus himself did. Later Spanish conquistadors like Cortés deliberately befriended the locals, even taking a local girlfriend, as a means of negotiating with the subject peoples of the Aztec Empire and extending their sway. Mediators could serve a number of useful purposes. They could explain local customs that might otherwise seem mysterious and do a kind of translation program, if you like, explaining how they're related to things the Europeans might be more familiar with. They could be literal translators in terms of translating languages, and you'd be surprised how quickly people can acquire other people's languages, even people who've never heard other languages before. And they could provide access to local dignitaries and be a sort of physical human mediator between them and negotiator. And they could engage in dialogue about European customs and cultures and the similarities between them and the culture of the locals. When Christopher Columbus first visits the Caribbean in the late 15th century, he is struck by the similarity between some of Spanish culture and what he believes to be the culture of the local king, whom he believes has good table manners, just as Spanish kings would. So that kind of dialogue and back and forth by which the Europeans and the locals could recognise each other as human, but also as having certain common cultural traits that might be, if you like, human traits, was a very important thing. Lastly, mediators, third dot point there, were important tokens, if you like, of the progress of civilization and even reason in the world. By adopting mediators as, if you like, honorary Britons, the British could break down barriers between peoples and convince themselves, as the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Dutch and others had before them, that there was a common humanity that spoke across these barriers and that there was a progress of enlightenment happening in the world that could bring people closer together. So to speak to a person we'll be encountering in a couple of weeks' time, Alida Equiano, who was enslaved in West Africa and taken to British North America as a slave, went back to England, where he learned to speak English like an educated Englishman, and indeed dressed like one as well. And yet he at the same time had the capacity and the knowledge to explain the horrific Middle Passage across the Atlantic on slave ships firsthand. So he could spellbind English listeners by being both English and providing an actual testimony of the horrors of the Middle Passage. Conversely, on the other side of things, that's of course Rammohun Roy there at the top, Ulladar's little plaque in London, bottom right-hand corner there, British mediators like the famous Dr. Livingstone, David Livingstone, could be important mediators facing the other way, bridging gaps with the locals from the British side. David Livingstone learned the languages of southern Africa, or several of them. He voyaged into the interior of southern Africa, drawing upon the knowledge of the locals, and he became treated as an honorary African to some extent. And so he was, in a sense, a more valuable figure as a mediator than other Britons were in more official capacities. So Raja Rammohun Roy was a mediator, and he fitted into some of these other models that I'm describing here. But he was a new and different kind of mediator, something the British and Europeans hadn't really encountered before, I think. He offered insights into India, but he also appeared to offer insights to the British about themselves. He was capable of connecting and comparing Indian and British culture and religion in ways that could startle the British. And he was completely and startlingly to the British unintimidated by British and European culture. He didn't for a moment feel overawed or like a second-class citizen. So at this point I'm going to pause and talk a little bit about the religion of the British in the 19th century, the 18th and 19th centuries in fact, to try and make a bit more sense of the role of Rammohun Roy as a mediator between the Indians and the British. Now, the British for centuries had liked to think of themselves as a tolerant people in religion and other matters. They still like to think of themselves that way to this day. It's a view that grew up in the early 18th century, really, in the aftermath of religious civil wars in England, when the Church of England, the established church, allowed a wider variety of points of view within it than other Christian churches mostly did. Nevertheless, the Church of England, while it thought of itself as supremely tolerant, was still an established state church, and anyone who didn't officially subscribe to it and its articles was thrust outside the national culture to a significant extent and had legal disabilities imposed upon them. Protestant dissenters who belonged to groups like the Presbyterians, the Methodists, Quakers and others were forbidden from different aspects of public life, as were Catholics and of course Jewish people, all of whom were discriminated against in various ways. But these various religious barriers were coming under siege around about the time that Rammohun Roy first interacted with the British and came to Britain. There was an increasing soul-searching happening in Britain and indeed in the English Church about the status of people outside the Church of England and of different religious points of view other than the official point of view of the Church. And there was a growing and increasing call for greater freedom for Roman Catholics, Protestant dissenters, and also Jewish people. Also at this time, the English Church was in a kind of cultural disarray, if you like. The Church had spread out across the British Isles, but more particularly England, in the case of the Church of England, in the Middle Ages, and established parishes all over the country. But this was done as a matter of convention and custom. There was no what we would call rationality to it. Some parishes were very large, others were very small. And as Britain's population grew dramatically in the conditions of industrialisation in the 19th century, the church increasingly looked like a medieval holdover. Parts of northern England that were industrialised, like Manchester, had one parish to cater for the entire city and indeed an entire county, while there were obscure parts of southern eastern and southern western England that had parishes that had almost no people in them. So there was an almost complete disconnect between the population growth and patterns of England and the traditional culture of the church. Also, second last dot point there, attendances at churches in England were shrinking dramatically over the course of the 19th century. In the Middle Ages, it had been customary to assume that you had to turn up to church on a Sunday to be seen as a decent citizen, and this custom continued one way or another into the 18th century. But in the 19th century, church attendance started to fall away quite markedly, and also the number of people breaking away from the official state church was growing markedly as well. So British Christianity, which a couple of centuries before had seemed vibrant, if you like, and flourishing, albeit spending a lot of time killing each other, in the 19th century appeared to be in retreat, perhaps not quite so much as it appears in the 21st century, but nevertheless in retreat. Last dot point there, at the same time, new and different forms of religious dissent were growing up in the 19th century at the time of Rammohun Roy's life. Not only pious religious dissenters of a Protestant disposition, or Roman Catholic holdovers, if you like, from before the Protestant Reformations, but also other more rational dissenting Christians who found much of the creed and the rituals of the Church of England to be mumbo-jumbo and wanted to create a kind of rational Christianity which could stand up under the scientific knowledge of the 19th century and under the emerging knowledge of other people's religions and cultures, and to try and create some sort of sense of a universal conception of religion that would transcend particular nations and peoples. And it's into this last current that Rammohun Roy emerges and with whom he makes connections when he arrives in England. Next point I wanted to make was about missionaries. Rammohun Roy's first experience of British Christians was some of the missionaries who made their way to India in his lifetime in the 1820s and afterwards. Missionaries were fairly thin on the ground in India. They were discouraged by the East India Company because they were thought to create trouble and dissension and to anger the locals. Of course, nowadays we often use the word missionary as a kind of boo word, as if to suggest that the missionaries are always up to bad stuff. The British state and the East India Company in the 19th century often thought of the missionaries as kind of unhelpful subversives in certain respects, because they tended to preach a Christian creed of equality, which was not really what the East India Company wanted to preach. But also, missionaries could be genuinely troublesome to the extent that they appeared to be privileging Christianity over the other religions of India. In India, missionary work was very rarely successful. Indian people had long, deeply entrenched religious traditions, be they Hindu or Muslim or Sikh or other, and they were hardly likely to be impressed by this strange foreign religion whose doctrines were often quite mysterious and confusing. Neither Hindus nor Muslims were inclined to be converted to Christianity, except the very poor, who, as I say, were sometimes converted by the message of equality, such as the lowest caste of Hindu culture, the so-called outcasts, who were sometimes attracted by that aspect of the Christian creed. But individual missionaries, even if they didn't convert very many people, and sometimes none at all, were successful as mediators. They had to learn the local languages if they were going to attempt to persuade the locals of the truths of the gospel. They had to attempt to understand the heathen religions of India, if only so as to be able to explain in what respects Christianity was different from them. So the missionaries were the first people, really, to get an intimate knowledge of the Indian religions, and to link that up with an intimate knowledge of the Indian languages, which were often religious languages as well, particularly in the case of Arabic, and also in the case of the Hindu Sanskrit. Missionaries were banned from India until the 1820s, and there's a typo there, but they were later used by the company to some extent to spread the word. Mostly, however, the company mistrusted them as agitators. And of course, they also had mixed relationships with the Indians. Some of the missionaries forged links with Indian people, others simply aroused their hackles by attempting to tell them that everything they believed was wrong. Out of the missionaries who travelled from England to India in the first decades of the 19th century, there's a standout example. This fellow on the right-hand side of the screen here, William Carey, you see here, him there on the top right-hand corner striking a noble pose with a local Indian. Bottom right-hand at the bottom there on the left, you can see what you may not expect, which is an Indian stamp with an image of William Carey, which reminds us that William Carey was not necessarily seen by Indians as a foe, but rather at times as a friend. He was the first missionary allowed into India by the East India Company because he was thought of as less scary than some of the others. And he was the first to play a key mediating role between the British and the Indians. He was born to a poor family in England. It was not uncommon for missionaries and religious figures more broadly. He converted to baptism, which was a form of Protestant Christianity outside the Church of England, as a young man, and he taught himself the European classical languages, the language of the ancient Mediterranean, and modern English languages, as well as ancient Indian languages as well, and also therefore developed a sense of the world family of languages, a question which became very important later in the 19th century. He had an extraordinary career in India. He created and was responsible for the first Indian language translations of the Christian Bible, both the New Testament and the Old. He created the first Sanskrit English dictionary for the use of the British in India, particularly for religious purposes. Conversely, he also produced the first English translations of Indian spiritual works into English to help the British understand Indian religion better. And lastly, he taught the Indian languages at the East India Company's College at Fort William in Calcutta. In order to print all of this various type of literatures, including especially the spiritual literature, he created the first printing press in India at Fort William. He created a paper industry to drive the printing press, and in order to disseminate the word around India, he also created the first steam engine. And so he was responsible for the introduction of a wide variety of modern technological accomplishments into India that the British had not bothered to introduce before. Lastly, he agitated against the company's censorship laws. They had been in the habit of censoring all the local publications to avoid unrest. Carey argued that this was an offence against what we would call freedom of speech. He advanced the study of European sciences in India, such as botany, agriculture. He introduced machinery, as I've said already, and he advocated the cause of lepers and low-caste Indians, particularly in the Hindu parts of India. He also campaigned against sati, the notorious practice whereby widows were sometimes encouraged to leap onto the funeral pyres of their dead husbands. William Carey was Rammohun Roy's first experience, if you like, of a good Englishman, of someone who wasn't simply trying to talk over the top of him, ignore him or patronise him, and they formed a long and enduring friendship, possibly the first friendship on that kind of degree of equality that there was between a Briton and an Indian. Lastly, when Rammohun Roy moved to England in the third decade of the 1900s, he moved amongst the unorthodox Christian Britons I've described already. So I'll just say a few words about that without wanting to get too complicated. The orthodox doctrines of Christianity then and for the most part today were what's conventionally called Trinitarian. They believed that God consisted of three persons: the Father, the Son, being Jesus, and the Holy Spirit. This was a doctrine that was established in the 4th century as a result of arguments in early Christianity about the nature of God. However, in the 18th century and also in the 19th century following it, in Rammohun Roy's time, there were a number of, if you like, rationalistic currents that arose in Europe questioning the spiritual and mystical character of Christianity as it had been inherited down the ages, and also questioning this doctrine of the Trinity, which they often regarded as a sort of weird Christian thing which got in the way of a negotiation or a dialogue between all the world's great religions. There was a tendency in the latter part of the 18th century and the first part of the 19th century to want to create a human Jesus figure, a wise, moral man who was primarily human and only secondarily to be considered as some sort of deity. When talking about Jesus in this way, these rationalistic Christians sometimes presented him as if he was a kind of saint or guru figure from other religions such as Confucius or the Buddha or whoever. And he became a different kind of figure from the figure he'd been in traditional Christianity. And as a result of that, these folks understood Christianity differently as well, in a way that made it easier to assimilate to the family of world religions and less idiosyncratic as it had previously been understood. The most visible face of these new unorthodox religious currents in London when Rammohun Roy first settled there were the Unitarians. Unitarians still exist today. The word means a variety of things, not necessarily exactly what it meant at that time. But at Essex Hall, bottom right-hand corner there, in London, in the early decades of the 19th century, the Unitarians met and envisaged a new kind of universal religion, which would draw upon the best features of all the different religions of the world, and which, in the case of Christianity, understood Christianity to be a religion of one God, not of a trinity, but of a single God, who could then be compared to the gods of other religions. Rammohun Roy was very impressed by the Unitarians, and he took their teachings to suggest that all the religions of the world could be seen, all the great religions of the world at least, could be seen as part of one great family. They all had certain characteristics in common, and the aspects that were different could be simply taken as a product of different cultures. A very modern view for someone in the early 19th century. In turn, the Unitarians took Roy as being like a kind of mascot for their idea that all the religions of the world could be seen as having something in common. And there I will leave our story for the second lecture pod, where I'll go into Rammohun Roy's life in more detail.